Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is John Temin. I'm the director of the Sudan and South Sudan program here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, though obviously spend some time on some other places as well. My first job today is to ask you to please turn off or mute your cell phones so we aren't interrupted. Let me also welcome people who are watching on our webcast today. Thank you very much for joining us. We are here today to discuss a country that has emerged as a major hotspot in 2012. Of course, Mali previously was thought of as somewhat of a pillar of democracy in West Africa, and 2012 certainly seems to have changed that impression. Of course, it's been battered by both a series of coups in the capital, Bamako, and the advance of a group of rebel movements in the north, taking over vast parts of that arid desert north. Some of those groups, of course, as we know, have some extremist linkages, but perhaps not all, and I think that's something we're going to get to in some detail today. Also, of course, some discussion of a regional intervention led by ECOWAS that seems to be at least months away, and continue to be a lot of questions about if and how that would work. And we have ongoing negotiations led by Burkina Faso that don't seem to have produced results, at least not yet. So we have a really good group of panelists to talk through these issues today, and we thank all of them for making themselves available on really difficult schedules. You have bios in front of you, so I'm not going to go into great detail on these people. We're going to hear first from Susanna Wing, who's a professor at Haverford College, who has written extensively on Mali, and who will focus her remarks on some of the developments in and around Bamako. We will then hear from a couple of political scientists from the RAND Corporation, Michael Shurkin and Stephanie Pizzard, who will talk more about some of the groups in the north and some of the various dynamics around them. And then we're very fortunate to have via Skype from Dakar over here on the TV, Andrew Leibovich, who is out there doing research on these exact issues, and will also talk in particular about some of the dynamics in northern Mali. So each of these people will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and so we're trying to leave plenty of time for discussion amongst them and question and answer from the audience. So let me thank you again for coming, and I will turn it first to Susanna.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure, an honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to be speaking about democratic failure and political crisis in Mali. It's always sort of hard to gauge how much knowledge people already have coming into this, so I'm doing my best to hit the nuts and bolts and give you some more detail. Let's go ahead. First, just a quick overview that, to my mind, I've spent a lot of time doing research in Bamako. I think it's pretty clear that any resolution of the ongoing humanitarian and security crisis in northern Mali does require addressing the political crisis in Bamako. And it really is a political crisis going on in Bamako. There's the question of elections and how and can the country move forward with elections. I would emphasize that, indeed, elections are crucial for any legitimate government to be in power, but it requires participation of the North. If the country moves forward with elections simply in the South, that's obviously going to further some of the divides in the country, and then it becomes a chicken and egg question. How do you have elections without resolving the North? How do you get control of at least the northern cities so you can have elections there to move ahead? But I do put that on the table as a crucial point. And also, that the current political crisis does have historical roots. I think there's been a lot of attention to the security issues in the north, a lot of focus on the security issues, and some forgetting about what's going on in Bamako itself. But the Tuareg rebellions have been going on certainly since the 1950s, and I would also say the failed decentralization plan of the 1990s has contributed to where we are today. Okay, so just a bit of background here, that as I'm sure you all know, that Mali's Third Republic was a model for democracy from 1992 until 2012. So 20 years in which the international community saw the country as a model. Certainly, as we've seen, it was a model without a strong foundation, and that's how we ended up where we are. But it did play this role. President Toure Atete had a policy of consensus politics. So he was an independent, no political party affiliation. And this ended up creating a political system that was really undermined in the sense that there was no viable and active opposition in the country. And people in Mali would speak very clearly about this, the fact that there was no opposition and the political class seemed to be maneuvering to be part of ATT's consensus politics. So this was part of the undermining of democracy in the country. In April of 2012, I would say there was no clear front runner. I don't think anybody could have said this person was absolutely going to be the winner. And that's a little bit different from the early election when Konare had been elected and then when ATT became elected. Really, the political field was opening up and there was some uncertainty as to what would be next. But in the spring of 2012, within Bamako, there was clearly widespread dissatisfaction among political elites. And if you go back and talk to people now, people will say, well, if you were listening, there were rumblings about a possible coup, and you had to be maybe a little bit blind to not see that. When I was there in October of 2011, I had friends who sort of said, these elections need to go smoothly, and if they don't, mark my words, something's going to happen. So there was just a sense of tension among the political class, towards the political class. And these tensions, I believe, are linked to the high levels of corruption that were very evident in the country, failures of decentralization, and then obviously the increasing Tuareg insurgency that was going on. So just quickly on decentralization. This really was a critical aspect of how democratization was meant to go forward. It was part of how they resolved in the mid-90s the problem in the north, that's how it was referred, through a series of concertation régionale in which there was an effort to promote dialogue, to then promote development and to try and incorporate the North into some democracy and development. By 1999, over 700 municipalities had been created across the country. But that being said, this core aspect of what democracy was supposed to do and this decentralization lacked, there was a lack of municipal autonomy. There was not effective transfer of resources. So it was sort of the institutions there without the core autonomy and resources needed to make it work. So in some ways, if part of the resolution of crisis in the North was decentralization, it was almost saying, here's the pie, but oops, we don't really mean it. We're not giving the whole thing, right? You put a proposal on the table, but the follow-through was not effective enough to make it really work. And there was poor training of civil servants. And finally, this lack of legal infrastructure was there, but the resources were not. Okay. So there's decentralization. ATT also had this program, PSPSDN, which was his big special program for peace, security, and development in the North with 5 key goals. I'll just go through the main points of these goals that he had: security, governance, development, communication, management. You can see all the ways that this was meant to be unpacked as a way to promote development in the North. This didn't work. This was a massive failure, I would say. The resources were never transferred, really, and it wasn't effective. The next slide, please. So the problem was that the focus of this PSPSDN was clearly security-based, and that this is from interviews with local actors and Malian national government officials, that it was really trying to beef up the police and the security. And this, I argue, was a critical problem because whereas a lot of the complaints about what was going on in the North were development-focused, this was trying to simply really focusing on the security aspect of it. And I have spoken with people in charge of the PSPSDN who said, no, it wasn't well conceived and it wasn't well financed, effectively financed. And so essentially, I put this on the table as yet another way in which the state was trying to address some issues but didn't really follow through. And so it just re-emphasizes the problem of the alienation in the North. Okay, so that's background. Probably what many of you are concerned about is what just happened last week and who's in charge. Good question. Captain Amadou Sanogo, who was the coup leader, clearly reasserted his presence as being behind the scenes, pulling strings when he he forced the resignation of the Prime Minister Sheikh Modibo Diarra. And so while we do have the interim president, Jakonde Traoré, who was a former president of the National Assembly, and is very much a political insider because of his role that he's been playing in the country as the president of the National Assembly. He remains head of state, but along comes Sanogo and says, well, we're removing the prime minister. Diarra was clearly ruffling a lot of feathers. He is the son-in-law of Moussa Traoré, and many of the people who he put into the government were related to the Traoré government. So there was resistance and resentment towards that influx of so many people from that era in Mali. And he also was very clearly acting I don't know if I should say on his own, but without consensus, without clearly working along with Jakonde Traoré in terms of resolving the crisis and really sort of going it alone. And I think people will say he has very clear presidential aspirations. He was taking the stage maybe a bit too much, and so that sort of underlines some of the reasons why he probably was forced to go. So now we have the current Prime Minister, Django Sissoko, who has been referred to as a consensus figure because he has worked for Traoré, Konaré, and ATT. He's got a long political history in the country. And so his credentials cross all these different regimes. It's really too soon to tell what he's going to do and how effective he is going to be. Part of me doesn't really believe that just changing some of these political actors is going to get to the heart of the real problem of what's going on, and that is that there's a political class which is very clearly divided, people who are in support of the coup, people who are against the coup, people who have their own political aspirations, etc. So we can hope that there will be some swift movement forward, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Okay. The Haut Conseil Islamique du Mali, I wanted to point out, just since we're going to be talking about the North, and obviously the question of Islam and politics comes up in this, to talk about the increased role of Islam in politics prior to the crisis in the South. So the president of the Haut Conseil is Mahmoud Dicko, who was formerly the president of the Independent Election Commission. There's a vice president, Sharif Ousmane Madani Haidara, who is a very important spiritual leader in the country. He's a bit of a celebrity with a mass following. These are the two key actors of this Haut Conseil. The Haut Conseil is a government institution that's role is simply consultant. It consults with the government on issues of concern to the community, and it's supposed to offer some religious voice towards issues that arise. And this we saw during the family law reform and the ability of the Haut Conseil to mobilize thousands and thousands of people across the country to protest more progressive laws with respect to family law. So we already saw the increasing role of the Haut Conseil. However, the Haut Conseil is divided between the president, Mahmoud Dicko, and Sharif Ousmane Madani Haidara, the vice president and the president. At one point, it was stated the vice president had quit, and then he said, no, I didn't really. And so there's tension, and this tension falls on, to my mind, the differing views that these two people have with respect to negotiation with actors in the North. For instance, Dicko did meet with Ansar Dine and MUJAO, and this was seen by Haidara as something that should not have been done. In the face of extremists in the North, I would say that Dicko has actually become a relatively moderate voice, and I think he's going to have an increasing role in the country. When I was there again in October 2011, people sort of referred to les Islamistes, the Islamists, in a sort of a derogatory fashion of, well, they're driving this agenda, they're driving that agenda. But suddenly these moderate religious players in Bamako are looking quite moderate relative to what is going on in the north. And so I think we're going to be seeing, again, increased role for these folks. And DICO was criticized widely by Haidara for negotiating with Ansar Dine and MUJAO. So in terms of what I would put my finger on when we're looking at Mali, since I was just speaking about the role of religion in politics, I will emphasize that Mali is, as I'm sure you know, it's a secular state in the same French model. And that's important because so far the government has been very clear that that is not up for negotiation. Territorial integrity is not up for negotiation, and the secular nature of the government is not up for negotiation. So that puts us in a pretty tricky situation in terms of how the country is going to move forward. But the political instability in the South, there's no question that it helps to perpetuate the northern crisis. I did make some reference to the fact that you can switch around the players in the South, but until you're really dealing with some of the core issues, I think some of these problems are simply going to resurface again. The current transition government does obviously lack legitimacy. Mali has a very vibrant civil society, and I believe that, in fact, given the history of the country with respect to the National Conference that was the moment of the creation of the Third Republic in 1991, is that I believe Mali should be looking forward towards a repetition of something like a national conference, a dialogue, a national dialogue that takes place on the model of this national conference, because it wasn't something that was created at that moment. The Mali has a history of using dialogue to resolve problems. Now it's a diverse country, and the political players are different. And how do you include such diverse players, and who do you include? But I don't think that this can be resolved without real dialogue going on in Bamako to try and move forward, dialogue amongst Malians themselves. And I think this is where the civil society can be very important. This is where religious leaders from the South can be very important. They have widespread support. They are critical players because they are so respected by the populace at large. And that, so I do think that we're going to see, we've already seen a shifting role for these religious leaders, an increasing role, and I believe that in terms of dialogue in the country, they will be critical players. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Stephanie.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Susanna. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss the situation in Mali with you. So our presentation, Michael and I, we will focus on a sort of overview of who's who in northern Mali. What are the key groups of the population who are involved in the armed groups? What are their main motivations? And what does that mean in terms of potential solutions to the crisis in the north? Next slide. So very quickly, the current crisis in the north is enmeshed in multiple crises. I'm not going to develop this much because Susanna has said pretty much everything that needed to be said about the political crisis, the overall political crisis in Bamako, the long-term struggle between Bamako and the north, and the fact that the latest rebellion that started the current crisis was just one of a series, a long series that started in the 1960s. A third element is the fact that there's also a competition in the north between different factions who are looking for power and for economic advantage. And who these different factions are actually is very relevant to understand the current situation. Mali's ethnic faction present a very complex network. Probably most of you already know that northern Mali has 4 major ethnic groups, which are Tuaregs, Arabs, Songhai, and Pearls. And each of these groups has multiple subdivisions. Just looking at the Tuaregs, for instance, and we'll come back on this later, They are divided into confederations, each confederation being further divided by caste and by clan. And we emphasize the complexity of these human factors because we believe they are key to identifying viable solutions to the crisis, because any attempt to solve the crisis in northern Mali will require to know whom exactly to engage, and it will also require anticipating potential unintended consequences, and they are very numerous in this case. And identifying solutions can also be done only through achieving a detailed knowledge of the human terrain. Who are the clans, who are the tribes, how do they interact, what are their respective interests. And we also need to understand better the drivers of group adherence. Why do certain groups or certain individuals go toward certain armed groups? Why MUJAO rather than Ansar Dine? And there's a whole range of motivation that go from clan loyalty to religious ideology, also including economic opportunism.
So this slide is sort of to make an impression on you, but also that there's some important bits of information here. This is not my work. This is taken from Pierre Boilet's work. I cannot vouch for the accuracy of it, but it's accurate enough to make the points that I want to make. This is simply one Tuareg tribal confederation, with each of these names representing a specific clan. They're arranged in kind of horizontal and vertical orders of hierarchy, with these groupings sort of represent sort of affiliations, associations. This is not an order of battle. There's no sort of direct command and control where, like, if one group is above the other, then they tell the other what to do, and it doesn't work like that. This is more sort of a social prestige, pecking order, etc. Some things here, if I might use this lightsaber, it's kind of crazy. In this box here, I regret I can only do this for one of these slides at the time, so if you forgive me for that. There's this box in the upper left. These represent this sort of elite among the elite of the Tuareg nobility. So this whole top level in green, those are nobles. Below them are historically vassals. The top left cluster here are sort of the cream of the cream. These are the Afogas, and one will often hear these people being referred to. These are the folks that have been driving the insurrections since 1963. They're sort of among the Tuareg, the key drivers of a lot of what goes on here. Groups that one should be aware of, there's the Kalafela and the Ariak in here. Kalafela I put in purple because that's the clan of the Amenokal. The Amenokal is the tribal leader of this entire thing. He's an octogenarian by the name of Adher Agantala, and I hope I got that right. So sort of if this group here is the Kam de la Kam, then the Kalafela represents sort of the Windsor family among them. Also of note in terms of players, there's the Idnan. It's hard to see in this slide. I really need to change the color of the font here. Idnan, the Ifugumisan, and the Shemenamas. These are players that are very active for various reasons. And that for various reasons, they've been active in kind of competing in order to enhance their stature relative to the other clan. Next slide, please. There's a geographic aspect to this here. Here's the valley of Telemsi. It's Telemsi Arabs that are associated with MUJAO and Gao. You have Shemenamas, Kelasuk, those Idnan that I spoke of. The Kalafela are very remote, which also has some meaning in terms of their cultural affiliations and their historic relationship with the French, etc. So there's like a geopolitical aspect to this in terms of controlling who's next to whom, who's controlling trade routes, who has access to water and pasture, that sort of thing. So all of these things are factors that are playing a role in what's going on. Next slide, please. Now, part of my case for the relevance of all of this has to do with the fact that as late as the 1990s, we saw a clear correlation between rebel groups or armed militant groups and clans. So on the left column are all of the, not all, but most of the armed militant groups of the 1990s. And on the right are the different clans, plus the Arabs who are affiliated with the FIAA. Moving forward, it's, well, we can get into this a little bit later. Stephanie's going to bring this up. These lines have blurred to some extent, so I can't argue that you can reduce everything to this. These are important factors that are placed to begin the conversation and a good way to start our understanding of the complexity of the situation, the dynamics of it. But I would caution anybody from saying that we're arguing that everything can be reduced to this. It's really not the case. But this is how we start to take apart what's going on here. Next slide.
So speaking quickly about the drivers of group adherence, why do certain groups or certain individuals decide to join specific armed groups, since there's a choice of them now in the north of Mali? One element is clan solidarities and competition. Michael just discussed that a little bit, but there's, in many cases, a desire of traditional subalterns or groups that have been dominated in the past to sort of make use of the situation to reposition themselves, maybe in an opportunistic way. One example among many, the leader of Ansar Dine, whose name is Iyad Agali, tried to become the lead of the Ifogas, to become the Amenokal that Michael showed in this table, and was rejected as the leader of this confederation. And there's been thinking is that's one of the major elements that prompted him to create his own group. He also tried to become the leader of the MNLA, the main Tuareg rebel group, and was rejected as well. So there's definitely different ideology, but also a willingness to maybe create one's own group and rival the traditional groups and maybe become more successful than they have been, which happens to be maybe the case now, since Iyad Agali is definitely a key player in the political negotiations now. A second element is geostrategy. All these groups are located in different areas, and they're located in different areas because some part of the population in these areas is more likely to accept them, but at the same time it's a reciprocal relationship, and they've also been recruiting more heavily. So for instance, MUJAO has been recruiting heavily Songhai, who are more present in Gao. AQIM is more present in Timbuktu, where there are more Barabish Arabs who, part of that community has had long-standing ties with them. And there's also a willingness to be positioned on certain routes in certain areas that can also be of use economically. Religious ideology is another important factor. A lot has been said about the fact that Mali's Islam is traditionally Sufi Islam, which is completely antagonistic to Salafism. We also know that in the past 10, 15 years, a more radical form of Islam has been spreading in the north, also in the south. There are, for instance, some research about some so-called Wahhabi villages near Gao. There are some sort of pockets of more radical Islam, and generally an increase in numbers of madrasas, of foreign preachers. Not all of them preaching violent actions, far from that. But the tide has turned a little bit in terms of what type of Islam is not just mainstream but accepted in northern Mali. Political ideology is another important factor. This is mostly for the MNLA, the Tuareg rebel group. Again, it's this claim for independence that has been going on since the 1960s and that is still active to this day. And a fifth factor is economic opportunism, and that's a big factor. We can bring back everything to group loyalty. Some groups themselves see economic opportunism in allying with some armed groups. Some tribes, some families have had long-standing family and business ties with the QIM, for instance. But this is also true at the individual level. Northern Mali is a very desolate place economically, very few economic opportunities, and over the past 5 to 8 years, there's been also increased drug trafficking in the region, which is much more lucrative than the types of trafficking that traditionally existed. And as a result, you've had a massive influx of money, some fortunes made overnight. And this has also changed society in the sense that it's also creating some models of how to make it economically for young people who don't have any other economic opportunity, really. One thing that's important about these 5 factors is that they're not mutually exclusive. Actually, they're at play at the same time for most people and most groups, and you really have to take them into account simultaneously to understand why a certain group or a certain individual is gonna get closer to one of the armed groups active in northern Mali today. So we attempted to make a rough factional breakdown of the different groups in northern Mali. This is not. This is really to be taken with caution, because the point we're trying to make is that several groups are present in different armed groups. You find Arabs and Tuaregs pretty much everywhere. You have also foreign Arabs or versus Malian Arabs, but here the distinction is a little difficult because lots of Malians have family ties in Algeria, for instance, or in Mauritania. So does that make you foreign or Malian? It's a bit of a fuzzy distinction there. But what's important to note is that some members of the factions above also are not aligned with any armed groups. Lots of people are adopting a wait-and-see approach. So we're not trying to say that these groups are entirely aligned with Ansar Dine or MUJAO or AQIM. Also, we are highlighting groups here, but again, there is also a lot of individual motivations for joining a group or another. So we cannot reduce all of these dynamics to a group dynamic. Now, what does it have as implications for potential interventions or potential solutions? And we're going to focus first on the solution that's currently being put forward as the most likely to happen, which is the intervention of West African troops under the ECOWAS flag, probably with French logistical support, maybe other foreign support that still remains to be decided. We see a few key issues and challenges with this potential ECOWAS intervention. The first one is the fact that northern Mali's terrain is very difficult logistically and operationally. And we're not entirely sure that the sub-Saharan armies who are currently likely to participate in this intervention would have the ability to really handle this terrain well. This has been very difficult for the Malian army itself. In 2009, when they finally defeated the last rebellion by Ibrahim Agbaranga, they had to rely on local militias, on local guides, on people from the north who had the knowledge of the terrain. A second point is the fact that deploying outsiders, non-Malians, may antagonize local populations who are currently opposed to Islamists, but who may rally around Islamists if they feel they are threatened from the outside. And there's also here a racial element. The worst violence in the past in Tuareg rebellions has been between Tuaregs and Arabs on one side who define themselves as white, and Songhai, including Songhai militias like the Gandakoi who define themselves as black. And there is a fear that sub-Saharan African armies may be perceived as an aggression by the Malian and Tuareg population. There's also a risk that the militias that existed in the 90s and were reinstated in 2006, 2007 could actually also attack the civilian population, as has been the case in the past. So this could actually increase violence for the civilian population rather than reduce it. Also, an intervention may spread the conflict to neighboring countries like Algeria and Niger, who currently the Arab and Tuareg communities in these countries are not directly involved, to consider it's not exactly their business, but there's already been signed and some statements by some Tuareg leaders in Algeria, for instance, that if there was a foreign intervention, then that would become their business and they would get involved. And the last point is an intervention also would not address any of Mali's developmental and political problems. This is all the issues of decentralization that Susanna underlined. The ECOWAS intervention would basically be a short-term fix, but would not fix the reason why the rebellion took place in the first place.
So very quickly, there's a question of what options we have. One option is if we're concerned that ECOWAS is going to start a race war and radicalize local population, then perhaps the best way to deal with that, to mitigate against that risk, is through mobilizing local support for ECOWAS. In other words, working in an arrangement where ECOWAS comes in with local allies. These could be Tuareg groups, these are going to be Arab groups, but they're definitely groups who have an interest in working with the Malian government and working towards a solution, and also working against the militants. That's one option. Another option, and that's working with the assumption that ECOWAS is going to happen, whether we like it or not, which might be the case. Option two is to pick a winner, any winner. This is the French colonial method. You basically pick somebody, he's your strongman, you arm him, you give him money, and you unleash him. And it can work. It's worked in the past. The French held on and secured the place for 50 years. The problem is that will only bring a short-term solution at best. And Malian northern political culture has changed, whereas it used to be that you can pick a Tuareg faction, arm them, enable them to beat up on everybody else, and everybody would kind of put up with this political order that the French have imposed with these Tuareg collaborators. That's not really the case anymore. No, the northern Malians are no longer interested in being dominated by a single individual, including Gali, or a single faction, including the Ifoga Tuareg clans. And then option three, which we favor, is to build a coalition of winners. In other words, you're not just pick a winner, any winner. You try to work together with different groups, and there are a lot of different groups, a lot of possibilities in order to bring together a coalition. So I hate to use this expression, a coalition of the willing, of people who are interested in working together in order to sort of move things forward towards a better ending. The fact that I think this is possible because I think that these groups exist and people exist, and there's a real interest on the ground in order to do this. And then lastly, finally, whatever one does, a long-term solution requires getting Mali back on track and getting Mali and democracy back on track. By getting Mali on track, among other things, the army is empty and it needs far more than simply short-term sort of counterterrorism tactical capabilities. That's the sort of thing the U.S. military has been focusing on in the past. That's not enough. Similarly, for democracy, it's not enough just to have elections. There needs to be a more exhaustive process. Things like the decentralization and the democratization process of the 90s were flawed, but I think the basic idea and the basic theory was sound, and we need to sort of go back to that and think about how to do that better. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Stephanie. So we should have Andrew in Dakar. Andrew, are you there? Oh, boy. He's speaking, but we can't hear him. Britt? Okay. All right. Is he still talking? Yeah. He's talking away.
Now he knows.
Okay. All right. Apologies, Andrew. Okay. Andrew, we just started hearing you now, so please thank you for joining us and start from the top.
Okay. Well, so thank you for inviting me. I think this is a really important discussion to be having, and thank you to Susanna, Michael, and Stephanie for the presentations. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. So I think while Michael and Stephanie have done a really excellent job of illuminating many of the specific divisions and issues currently at play in northern Mali, I'm going to pull back a bit to look at possible scenarios and outcomes in dealing with militant groups there, as well as what for me are the major questions surrounding these groups, and also the prospect for a political solution as opposed to an intervention in northern Mali. So as I said, I'll be raising a series of broad issues, but I'm happy to discuss any of them in more specific terms during the Q&A. So very briefly, since January, when the fourth Tuareg rebellion since Mali's independence broke out, things in northern Mali and also in southern Mali appear to have been progressively going from bad to worse in some ways. And so following the full departure of the Malian armed forces from the north and the subsequent seizure of the main cities of Kidal, Gao, and Timbuktu by the MNLA, Ansar Dine, AQIM, and MUJAO, northern populations have been subjected to a series of really horrendous privations and abuses, which have been well documented by a number of outside observers. But nearly 500,000 people have fled the fighting and subsequent events, while others have had to cope with increasingly strict rule by the major Islamist groups, so Ansar Dine, AQIM, MUJAO, as well as difficulties dealing with food security, availability of electricity, and other basic necessities of daily life. So while regional governments in the international community have grown increasingly alarmed at the humanitarian security situation in the north, especially as these Islamist groups have progressively pushed the MNLA out of the north, whether by force, as was the case recently with fighting with MUJAO in Gao, in Songo, and recently Menaka, or by persuasion and defection, the MNLA has progressively lost fighters and lost influence and presence in the north. So as Stephanie pointed out very briefly, Ansar Dine largely is believed to control Kidal, whereas MUJAO is in Gao and other towns and villages along the Niger River, as well as Douenza, which is the kind of the southern edge of the territory controlled by the Islamists. And Ansar Dine and AQIM forces control Timbuktu, though AQIM has been reported throughout northern, and I think it's really quite difficult at times to talk about differences between these groups as they seem to exchange people and operate in the same territory with relative ease. The control of northern Mali by jihadist groups, as well as the reported influx of foreign fighters and the establishment of training camps in northern Mali, has led some to suggest that Mali is heading in the direction of Afghanistan or Somalia, the term that some people have picked up, Sahelistan. So as I'll say, it's very problematic. In some ways, the current situation reflects the culmination of an effort over a number of years by AQIM, by its successor group, the GSPC, to establish itself in northern Mali. And northern Mali, before and after the current crisis, has been used as a base for attacks and kidnappings in Mali, in Niger, in Mauritania, Algeria, and elsewhere. Though I do think it's important to remember that there are a number of causes for the current crisis in the north that go far beyond just militancy and extremism. And militancy and extremism represent only a small part of the population and these factors. So statements from another thing to consider is that according to U.S. and foreign government officials, and there's some evidence for this, though I think it's a bit mixed, AQIM is said to be deepening its connections with groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, as well as jihadist groups in Libya and other countries in North Africa, though I think the extent of these connections are sometimes difficult to ascertain and are often subject to classified evidence that for people without access, it becomes very difficult to evaluate. I also think it's important to remember and important to point out that these links, if we're going to talk about transnational links and links between jihadist groups, if we're talking about Boko Haram in Nigeria or Ansar Sharia in Libya, these groups have access to weapons, to personnel, to support that are separate from AQIM. And so there's been a tendency, as these groups have increased their capability in the last year or before, to immediately conclude that this is because of links with AQIM. That may be part of the story, but I think it's far from the full case. And so people have to be very careful with these connections. I also think that for all of the concern and the valid concern about what's going on in northern Mali right now, I think that there's a lot that we don't know about these groups, which in turn could have a very serious impact on the evolving situation, on attempts to resolve the crisis in northern Mali, and also the possible reaction of these militant groups to an intervention or to a political solution. And that really depends on the answers to the questions I'm about to ask. So there are four main ones for me, but this is not a list. The first is, how much money do these groups have? So General Commander General of AFRICOM and also Department of Treasury officials have commented recently that AQIM is the best funded and best equipped of the al-Qaida franchises. And so while it's clear that ransom payments for kidnappings in particular, as well as income from other sources, have filled AQIM coffer and also MUJAO and Ansar Dine in recent years, we don't actually know how much money these groups have or how much they spend. So with AQIM, estimates range from $75 million in ransom payments to as high as $200 million since about 2003. But there are no good figures for these, at least in public, and I'm suspicious about other figures as well. We also know the degree with any degree of certainty the extent of other resources available to these groups, especially from smuggling operations. So to take the cocaine trade, for example, which has had an impact in northern Mali in recent years, not just on militancy, but also on social dynamics in northern Mali. We don't know the extent of the cocaine trade in the region. We don't know before the rebellion. And also, when you talk to different people about what the impact of the rebellion has been on the cocaine trade, you'll often hear totally divergent accounts. And this is very important because people throw around a lot of figures about the cocaine trade, but we don't know how much money is brought in from the cocaine trade or how much money is filtering back to militant groups. It's difficult to evaluate how much money they actually possess, how much money they spend, but also the impact of the rebellion on the cocaine trade may have an impact on the willingness of local elites, in particular, some of whom are believed to cooperate with these militant groups, to continue this cooperation and to continue to tolerate the overt presence of jihadist groups in northern Mali cities and towns. And then the last thing in this is that we don't know how much it costs to maintain fighters, to maintain operations in Mali. And recent anecdotal reports from Timbuktu and other towns suggest that at least some commanders may be starting to run short on money. So a failure to replenish or find other revenue streams or to cut deals for some of the hostages that AQIM and MUJAO have could impact their willingness and ability to maintain control of towns and cities. So the next big question for me is, how many fighters do these groups have? So again, estimates are widely divergent, from 4,000 to 10,000, and sometimes less. General Ham said that there were between 800 what he called hardcore fighters. Other sources have said as many as 2,000. But we also don't know how many recent recruits have joined these groups. And this is important because, as Stephanie and Michael pointed out, people join these groups for a number of reasons. It could be ideological, it could be due to lack of opportunity, due to access to other resources, any number of things. And so we don't know how these groups will be able to manage this influx of people. And in particular, as the MNLA has lost fighters and even in some cases commanders to Ansar Dine, this has been accelerated recently, it seems. We don't know how Ansar Dine is going to be able to deal with that. And there's a real possibility that this influx of fighters, and in particular for Ansar Dine, an influx of Tuareg, of other Tuareg, could cause them to shift their positions in certain ways. We can also ask some of these questions about foreign fighters in Mali. So Stephanie mentioned that sometimes it's very difficult to see how you would define a foreign fighter versus a more local fighter, and sometimes the terms we use don't really reflect realities in northern Mali or in the Sahel. But we've also, again, had widely divergent reports of how many fighters there are, where they've come from, et cetera. So I think with at least certain sources, there's a tendency to either overstate the presence of these fighters or overstate their possible influence. Again, multiple explanations we don't really know. The third question for me is, where are the fault lines between these groups? So MUJAO was born of, ostensibly, a split with AQIM. The former AQIM commander, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, was recently removed from the leadership of his group of fighters and then took his fighters with him away from AQIM. Again, this is at least what he said. And AQIM recently, according to reports, divided its own leadership, so creating new groups of fighters and promoting several other leaders to higher positions in the organization. So if these divisions are real and reflect fault lines within these organizations, between these organizations, this could inhibit a coordinated militant response to an intervention or to attempts at a political solution. But they also could show, I think, an effort to disperse and localize the activities of these groups as a means of remaining resilient in the face of external or Southern or Malian actions. And so it's something to keep in mind. And then the fourth thing for me to point out is that just what are the limits on the activities of these groups? So for lack of a better way to put it, logistics in northern Mali are incredibly difficult. And the provision of men, fuel, food, and other material are subject to external pressure. So it's very concerning to see reports of foreign fighters succeeding or attempting to reach northern Mali from North Africa, from the Middle East, from France, from elsewhere. It's instructive and it's interesting that at least some of these networks have been disrupted, reportedly in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Morocco, and even in southern Mali. And Algeria also militarily has been able to exact a toll on MUJAO and on AQIM fighters in the north, but also in southern Algeria when they've tried to obtain supplies and especially fuel to take back to Mali. So I do think that this has an impact on operations, and there's a real possibility of inhibiting the activities and the potential for these groups to spread outward because the international community, because regional governments are watching so closely what's happening in northern Mali. But to transition a bit, much of the talk so far in favor of a military intervention in Mali has been predicated on a belief that these groups, these militant groups, will either fragment or can be separated out from each other fairly easily, or that they'll just flee northern Mali's cities and towns in advance of or during an intervention. But I think the U.S. in particular and the UN also have shown some concern that this may not be the case, or that an ill-conceived intervention force could get bogged down, could commit abuses, or could help spread instability to other countries, which explains the push from the U.S. and from the UN in particular for an intervention force to be well organized and very carefully planned. There's also pointed out the very widely held belief, and I give a lot of credence to this, that you really can't have a feasible solution in northern Mali without, to some extent, developing a more stable political dynamic in Bamako and pulling the military away from politics. And so given this really constant back and forth about whether or not an intervention will take place, at least in the short term, a negotiated political solution to the crisis in Mali has gained a lot of credence in certain circles as a means of saving Mali and surrounding countries from dealing with another open war in the Sahel, especially given the impact that the intervention in Libya had in Mali, Niger, and in other countries. So this effort to come to a political solution has prompted a series of meetings in Burkina Faso, in Algeria, in France, and recently in Nigeria this week with the MNLA. This effort culminated, I think, earlier this month in the first meeting between the Malian government, Ansar Dine, and the MNLA in Ouagadougou. So while a political reconciliation with some of the armed groups in the north holds out a prospect, I think a real prospect, potentially for a solution in the north that avoids further unrest, and it's a priority of the new Malian government, though the terms of such a reconciliation have yet to be defined. And there are also a number of factors and questions that need to be taken into account. So I'm going to deal with the Burkina Faso-led mediation efforts here, but we can talk about some of the other efforts, one of which Susanna mentioned in the Q&A. So the first for me is just the question of participants. So negotiations have tried to involve quote-unquote local actors, namely Dean and the MNLA, while excluding what have been termed terrorist actors or drug traffickers, namely AQIM and MUJAO. But maintaining this division, I think, is based in part on, really in large part, on Ansar Dine being willing and able to formally separate itself from AQIM and from MUJAO, even though these groups have worked very closely together and have also built over the years strong local ties and local linkages and the ability to operate locally, which I think blurs this distinction a bit. Additionally, the Ansar Dine delegates in Algiers, in Ouagadougou, and elsewhere have largely been Ifalas Tuareg or people close to the Ifalas. And so for me, it's clear if this represents all of Ansar Dine, I think it represents certain divisions among Tuareg Ansar Dine leadership, but it also doesn't necessarily reflect even the full leadership, which may be more diverse than some of the leading Ifalas Tuareg. So the second thing for me is just a question of terms. And so while various Ansar Dine leaders have talked about restricting their conditions to the implementation of Sharia in Kidal, is for now a non-starter with the Malian government anyway. Other leaders, in particular the Timbuktu-based Ansar Dine spokesman Sando Lama, have disputed this assertion, and Yara Ghali has been very unclear about what he actually wants as the final deal, and so he's endorsed the Burkina-led mediation efforts, as he did in August, but he's also said that he favors the implementation of Sharia in northern Mali and also in Mali in general. So this is yet to be determined. The third question for me is, how do you negotiate a deal without stability in southern Mali? So while President Traoré, or interim President Traoré, promised over the summer to set up a formal body to handle these negotiations, this is yet to take shape. And given the recent events in Bamako, as well as very strong disagreements in Bamako and outside of Mali, intervention versus negotiations, it's a real open question, I think, if the government in Bamako will be able to continue with reconciliation efforts in a way that can head off a military intervention. The fourth question for me is just what happens in the event of a deal? Assuming that you can come to a political solution, how do you separate Ansar Dine from AQIM practice, especially when you have a number of different parties who identify themselves as Ansar al-Din? Work if certain Ansar al-Din factions are willing to enforce this separation and are willing to, say, point out targets, but there are other problems associated with this, may or may not actually. I mean, if you proceed with targeted strikes against AQIM and against MUJAO in particular, how do you to target, who not to target? And then finally, what other populations in northern Mali? So as Michael and Stephanie pointed out, northern Mali is a diverse place, not just in terms of ethnicity, but also just in terms of politics, social relationships, religious views, and various other things. So most of the talk about a solution in northern Mali has focused on resolving Tuareg. We have to remember that a deal with Ansar Dine and the MNL and even the MNLA may not be popular with other Malians, other non-Tuareg, who are not aligned with either group. As Stephanie and Michael mentioned, there's also the issue of ethnic militias with a very history of sectarian violence, past rebellions, and failure to fully account for these militias when the Malian state returns to the north, could cause really significant ethnic strife. And finally, concerns about development, state stability, and political issues in northern Mali are not solely determined or governed by the state. So while understanding these ethnic dynamics is part of the puzzle, and it's an important part of the puzzle, it's far from the only one. And there are other things that have to be taken into account when trying to develop solutions for Mali. And while my remarks have focused on militancy, the problems and the debates underway in Mali are about far more than that. So any long-term approach has to be based on more than narrow concerns. So I'll end my remarks there, and I look to your questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate those remarks. So we're going to move to some discussion and question and answer. For people who want to ask questions, I'll ask that you please line up behind either one of these microphones that we have on the side of the room. Before we get to that, I want to give the panelists an opportunity, if you have any sort of questions for each other, comments on each other's presentations, even disagreements with each other's presentations, let me know if you want to jump in, please.
I just would like to chime in with something that Andrew was saying, and which has to do with whether or not Ansar Dine can be separated from al-Qaida in the Islamic Maghreb. And I think one thing that we should remember is that Yada Ghali is somebody who's been around as a Tuareg leader for a number of years and has shifted allegiances over this time in multiple occasions. And so I think that it should be sort of understood he's a very strategic and pragmatic guy, so it's not surprising that he's showing up to promote these talks. But I think really the question of can Ansar al-Din be separated from al-Qaeda, and can we truly take with more than a grain of salt, only a grain of salt, what Ideologies says that he'll do. I think we just have to look at the history of his pragmatism and opportunism in the region.
Thank you. Let me also note that for our viewers on the webcast, you can ask questions via Twitter that will then come to me. So please send those in if you feel like it. Looks like we have several questions. So let me ask each questioner to please identify yourself and where you're coming from and be very brief in your questions so we can fit as many as possible. Let's start here.
Hi, Yochid Driesen from The Atlantic. Just a very quick question. I think a lot of the coverage, particularly General Ham's speech, the implication was Yemen, Somalia, maybe where we're fighting now, where a threat is now, Mali, maybe where the next threat to the U.S. happens to be. I wonder if you could all please address that directly. Is there currently a threat to the U.S. from Mali? If not, how close might we be to seeing one? And if there is a threat, how significant is it?
Sorry, one or two more, so thank you. Let's go over here.
Good morning. I'm Bob Perito. I work here at USIP. I have a question about the influence of Libya in all of this. Much has been made in the press, as you know, about the remnants of Gaddafi's army flowing into northern Mali, along with a lot of weapons that have been looted from Libya. But you haven't mentioned Libya this morning at all. So is that a canard, or is the aftermath of Libyan conflict being played out in northern Mali? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take those two. Andrew, this might be good to start with you. Do you want to start on that?
Sure. The threat is always difficult because something is not a threat until it is, but I really am concerned about tendency to apply ways of thinking about these issues to try to apply them universally. So with Yemen, AQAP has a very different history than AQIM, has a somewhat different orientation. It just has a different composition, had a different relationship with al-Qaida, al-Qaida core, I should say. So with General Ham's comments about the next threat to the U.S. possibly coming from Mali, AQIM in northern Algeria has attacked certain foreign targets, foreign workers in the past, but France has always been AQIM's target. I have a hard time right now envisioning a threat, say, to the U.S. homeland coming from northern Mali. That's not to say maybe it won't betray us, but just for right now, I don't really see how that would happen or how that would shape out. I think the bigger threat really is to stability and security in the surrounding region, and possibly that such a threat would materialize in the form of potential attacks against Westerners or Western targets in the Sahel, just based on past capability and some of the constraints that I laid out in my remarks.
I would add to that. I agree with Andrew's remarks. I think my answer to the question is if the question is Mali a threat, my answer is, do you want it to be? In the sense that I think that there's a real risk of making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. There are things that one could do to really antagonize the population, to radicalize the population. Already we've seen that the limited but very visible U.S. military presence in northern Mali in the last 10 years has had an effect on radicalizing public opinion. It scares people to see C-17s fly in and out of Gao. They don't know what's going on or why it's happening, but it's there and they know about it, and it causes rumors. And there are all sorts of problems. I also think that there's a risk of making too many assumptions about what groups are. Particularly, what Stephanie and I are trying to do when looking at groups like Ansar Dine or MUJAO is to sort of take apart the complexity of it. There are a lot of people involved in these groups for a whole lot of different reasons, and I think for very few of them do those reasons really include international jihad against the West or anything like that. Their interests and motivations are generally far more parochial than that, and I think we need to make sure that that stays that way, and just let's be very mindful about that. And I think that there's a dangerous discourse about there's a discursive thing that happens when people hear AQIM. They think, oh, it's AQIM, you know, Bin Laden, all that. And then when they hear that there are people who are allied with AQIM, then they hear that they're allied with al-Qaida. So they too, you know, by transitive property. I think that's a very dangerous sort of discourse to get in on, because what happens is people intellectually sort of narrow their thinking down to what these things are and what the threat actually is. So, you know, I think we're all interested in trying to explain, you know, not so fast. Let's look at who these people are, and let's try to think about all the different motivations and all the different drivers and all the factors that are involved here. And I think we'll find that the situation, while it's very concerning, is not that scary, at least not yet. The sky is not yet falling.
Okay, I agree with everything that's been said, so I won't emphasize any more about the threat to the U.S. In answer to the Libya question, there's no question that arms and training, armed men came and into the Malian territory, and that really was an opportunity for these groups to move ahead more quickly and to be well armed. So we haven't spoken about it. I didn't speak about it simply because I think it's widely accepted that in fact it was an integral trigger to this. And you will hear people who say, let's be really careful. You know, people didn't predict that this might be an after effect of getting rid of Gaddafi, and so I think we need to think carefully about what a military intervention, what could be the side effects that nobody's really talking about yet and expecting. But there's no question there's a direct link.
Just to follow up on the Libya question, totally agree with what Susanna just said. Another important thing is that the influx of men and arms from Libya, not just for the Tuaregs but also other groups, was definitely instrumental in the timing of the crisis, timing of the rebellion. That doesn't mean that there would not have been another rebellion at some other points. I think it was more of a trigger, but it was in no way a root cause. And another important factor is that there was lots of Libyan weapons, definitely, but at this point, my understanding is that there's an equal number of Malian weapons in the north, because when the Malian army retreated south, they left barracks, arsenals that were looted by the different groups. So Libyan arms are only part of the problem at this point.
Well, then to add on to what Sebi said, there were not just the arms that were abandoned by the Malian, but there were arms, and in particular technicals, that were taken over by defectors, so people who had been integrated into the Malian armed forces who then left just before the rebellion or after the rebellion started. Another thing to point out when talking about Libya, while I agree with Susanna that Libya was in some ways a proximate cause, I think also can't allow that to hide the fact that the way the Malian government, the way Atate's government handled the return of these fighters and also some of these Tuareg populations in general did play a role. So you can look at Niger, which also dealt with an influx of former fighters, but had a very different way of disarming them, of trying to reintegrate them into the political structure. Whereas when people came back to Mali, as I understand it, and read it, tried to basically integrate people into the political framework and the security framework that he was already using in the north, and that very quickly isolated certain people and left a number of former fighters without really a possibility of integration or of doing anything else. And so I think that also approximate cause of the current rebellion, at least in terms of timing.
Thank you all. Let's take a couple more. Over here, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Engelken. I'm a recently retired Foreign Service officer who was working on Pakistan and Afghanistan as before. A lot of this sounds very, very familiar. Do we know anything about the ethnicity of the people who are fleeing the north? Because tens of thousands have left. And who's going?
Thank you. My name is Khadija Jenta. I'm a Malian. I really appreciate all the information given here, very detailed. I would like to comment on the decentralization aspect. As Susan mentioned, I totally agree with you, but decentralization cannot be effective. There is no full autonomy to the communes through fiscal decentralization. But my comment is that when you look at Mali and you look at decentralization in the Malian context, it's for the first time in our history from independence that Malians decided to be part of the decision-making, of their own development decision-making process. So in the Malian context, decentralization is like the devolution of power to the grassroots level. Traditionally, they said, "Kafanga seginso," meaning that bringing back power home. So for the first time, women, young, all the ethnic groups were able to get together at the level of the commune to make public decision about their own life. So as you said, it was big challenges, but I wouldn't call it as a failure. I know there were big challenges and we needed to face these big challenges. I used to work for USAID where we have invested a lot. As you said, we had a vibrant civil society organization at the local level. So this was a dynamic, and this crisis right now has jeopardized everything. Again, coming back to elections, my last comment, as Mikhail said, just having election doesn't ensure having democracy. We have seen it in the past. After how many decades of elections, everybody was thinking that Mali was an example in Western Africa, but it was like facade because nothing was working, the system was corrupted. So the civil society, in a way, they also failed to play their role as watchdog. So I don't know, looking at the crisis we are going through now, what could be the role of our civil society? And how? When you look at it again, I have so many comments, but the time is too strict, so I will let other people comment. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention. So three things on the table. I think the ethnicity of people fleeing and some feedback on decentralization and also the role of civil society. Susanna, you want to start?
Sure. The quick answer to the ethnicity question is everybody. Tuareg, Songhai, Peul, everybody. It's to my mind, there's no distinction really in terms of who's fleeing. Decentralization, I absolutely agree, and my point about what was so important about the decentralization process in Mali was how participatory it was, how they went to the commune level to ask villages to participate in creating the borders of these municipalities and what are the issues you want to put on the table. So it's a remarkable example of participation. And to my mind, that's part of the problem was that it was this sort of glorious role of dialogue and participation and enthusiasm on the part of all Malians who were able to participate in the process, and then the complete state failure to follow through, to continue to support, and to do so with resources and real autonomy that those resources would allow. So it underscores how important participation is in Mali and to the Malian people, and that people felt like they were part of this project. But then what? The same old folks still have the money, and the same folks are still in charge. And that only serves to aggravate people. But I think there is this institutional infrastructure that was created from the bottom up, and that should be recognized as something that does actually exist. Now, how do you get the resources and promote the autonomy of these municipalities effectively? And in so doing, incorporate Malian people in these solutions. So. And then the civil society, I'm so glad that you did say civil society failed in terms of being watchdogs. Now, my experience in Mali as I watched over the years was under ATT was when we really saw civil society failing. And to my mind, this had a lot to do with his ability to co-opt people. Once there was no opposition, everybody had an opportunity to then be part of the system. And so why would you challenge when really you could maybe have a more lucrative position doing something else as part of the government or et cetera. So if you can be co-opted, then why stand firm against the government and be a watchdog and push? And I think that's really what we saw in ATT. I believe under Konare, there was a lot more vibrancy, there was opposition, there was challenging, civil society was playing its role. So I sort of point the finger to the last 10 years of the ATT regime.
If I may, I think we shouldn't be too hard on the Malian Republic. I think it's unfair to say that it was destined to collapse, that it collapsed of its own accord. Remember, it's ultimately the actions of a young Captain Sanogo that sort of took it out. It reminds me of like the French Third Republic, which was weak and had all sorts of problems. It ultimately, if the Germans had never invaded, it would have done just fine for another 100 years. There's no reason to think that if Captain Sanogo hadn't launched his coup, and it's not clear to me that he has any particularly complex political ideas in his head, we would have lurched, the Malian democracy would have lurched forward towards an election, and there would lots of problems, which we can all agree, but it takes time, and there's a lot of evidence to be optimistic about Malian democracy, even the current republic, even as it was, that there would have been elections. Election would have yielded a new change, and it could have improved itself. It could have thrived. All the ingredients for a successful democracy in Mali are there, and it would be, I think, a real tragedy if people, Africans, Westerners, were to conclude that democracy is not a good idea for a country like Mali, or perhaps that democracy is not right for all cultures and countries, which is something that, like, I think is anathema it should be anathema to all of us.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, I want to keep going. I want to go to a couple of questions we received on Twitter, and then we'll get to the other questions still in the room. One question comes from Burkina Faso. What does Sissoko's elevation to prime minister mean for any sort of UN or ECOWAS troop involvement in the north? Sooner, later, or not at all? That's one. And then a second question comes from Nicholas Blaine. As other institutions have previously asserted, the UN Security Council said last week that the crisis in Mali has its root in climate change. Do you agree? You want to do that? Climate change.
I'll start with climate change. There's actually a case to be made that most of the conflict of the Sahel is a result of climate change. Darfur, for instance, is linked to climate change. Mali and northern Malian society really fell apart with the droughts of the 1970s and the droughts of the 80s, which really, really knocked the structure, the hierarchies, the society on the head. It forced very large percentages of young Malians, Tuareg, Arab, Songhai pool to go abroad. So, for instance, Songhai ended up in Ghana, and once in Ghana, they also got exposed to, among other things, different forms of Islam that has ramifications for today. Tuareg ended up in places like Algeria and Libya. The ones who went to Libya, like Iyad al-Ghali, ended up signing up for the Libyan army, fighting in Lebanon as part of the Islamic army, and getting all sorts of new political ideas. And that's sort of the immediate context. They talk about the issue more social of, like in France, they have the 1968, like the 68 generation. In northern Mali, it's this Ishumar class that comes from the droughts of the 80s. These people who went abroad and then they come back with all sorts of new ideas. Now, I will certainly not make any claim that the droughts of the 80s have anything to do with climate change. I mean, who's to say? But climate and environment and desertification play major factors in what's going on throughout the entire Sahel. So. I wouldn't. It's possible. It's very possible.
I'm going to take a stab at the question about Sissoko's elevation to prime minister. What I would say is what we just saw with Sanogo stepping in and arresting the former prime minister simply points out that the army's still playing much too strong of a political role in the south, and for all of the push from the UN, the US, to get the political house in order, this simply reemphasizes that the army is playing too much of a role, and I think that there will be some hesitancy to move forward. One would think there would be hesitancy to move forward quickly with an intervention and to continue to push for legitimacy in the South. That being said, and for the army to really step out of the picture. That being said, at least 3 ministers that were just named on the government are military. So, and we've just seen Sanogo's role, and the U.S. and France have just stated that they're pushing for a resolution by the end of this week with the Security Council. So I don't really know what that means in terms of that scenario, but I would say that it's clear Sanogo is very clearly playing a role, and I think that's going to make people cautious about an intervention.
I'm sorry, I wanted to add one more remark about the environment, but I think it's important for everything we've been talking about. It is extremely hard to survive in northern Mali, to live in the Sahara. It's very hard. It's hard for all of these people to hang on to their very tenuous existence. The great German anthropologist Geert Klute wrote his dissertation on, I don't remember if it's Nigerian or Malian Tuareg, but I'll never forget the title. The title of his dissertation is The Hardest Job in the World. And when you read his dissertation, and he talks about how you actually survive as a Tuareg goat herder in the Sahara, you think, oh my God, it is so hard to do, which is why the climate is such a big deal, and all of these economic issues. So, for instance, if you try to secure the border of these regions because you're worried about trafficking, there's an immediate impact on commodity prices in the markets throughout northern Mali. Right? So if you're worried about drug trafficking, so you shut that down. In the process, you shut down the cooking oil that's smuggled across from Algeria. All of a sudden, people are at risk of starving, right? Because it's that sensitive to any kind of situation. So progressive droughts, progressive desertification, all of these things are putting tremendous pressures on this society. And a lot of what's going on has to do with then this sort of scramble for whatever one can do, access to resources, access, even if the resources is a cocaine trade route or an NGO that's working in your town. If you can get a job, the NGO, your family can survive. Sometimes I think it's like that great painting, The Raft of the Medusa, where all these people are on this raft in the middle of the ocean, these castaways, and they're sort of scrambling on top of each other to survive. There's a little bit of that going on in northern Mali, and I think among other things that should give us some sympathy for these populations, but I think it should also make us appreciate that economics matter a great deal, and there's this tremendous competition going on, which is also why, part of my response why this isn't about necessarily terrorism. It's, for a lot of these people, it's really about survival.
Thank you. Andrew, in Dakar, do you want to briefly jump in on any of these points?
I want to agree with Michael's last point that this is about much more than terrorism. To go back, climate change may not we can speak to the role of droughts, but I think it's also important to remember that some of this is also about, especially in the 70s and 80s, the development of the oil economy and the influx of oil money in Algeria and in Libya in particular that drew people in, I think, regardless, maybe not on the same scale, and it would not have caused such a disruption, such an incredible disruption in local society, local hierarchies, the way of life in northern Mali, but it would have still had an impact. I generally defer to Susanna on all things Bamako politics. The thing about Sissoko is it's too early to tell. I've been very interested to see his recent comments, and this morning he gave an interview with Radio France International, where he really prevaricated on whether it be an intervention and on whether we're talking about an intervention or when we're talking about retaking the north, if it's a reconquest of the north, or if it's more a kind of rehabilitation, reabsorbing the north, which to me suggests the possibility that there's going to be another push for a political solution, and people who are looking at why the junta forced DR to resign. One of the reasons given is that the junta was looking for a political solution, and that DR was pushing too aggressively, and in particular, pushing too aggressively with France and with others to accelerate a military solution in northern Mali. So I think we should just keep that in mind.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions from the audience here, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Mustafa Toure. I am from Mali. I'm not only from Mali, I'm from the northern Mali. I was born in Gao. I grew up in Timbuktu. I also grew up in the south. I grew up in Kai, Bamako, and I worked in Sikasso. So I'm a gifted Malian who knows all the regions of the country, and I had the opportunity to study with Tuaregs. And also, I have a sister, my bigger sister has a Tuareg mother. So the Malian Tuareg problem is a very complex problem and has two big aspects, an international aspect and a national aspect that only Malians can resolve. Why there is an international aspect? Because when you are talking about Tuaregs, Susanna talked about Nobel. She talked about the ethnic group in the north. Effectively, the major ethnic group in the north are Sonrai, Peul, Bambara, Bozo, and Tuaregs. The Tuaregs are the minority in the north. So, why the northern problem is always raised by Tuaregs, armed Tuaregs? They are not the only ethnic group living there. All these ethnic groups are living the same conditions, the same tragedy there. So, when you talk about Tuaregs, why Tuaregs are very important? Because when you talk about northern Mali, Mali is here, you have Mauritania, Algeria, Niger, Burkina Faso. There are Tuaregs all over here in this region. Okay, so my question is why the Tuaregs are the only people who raise their problem with arms in the north of Mali? They are nobles, because if you talk about nobles, they are slaves also. There is a racist problem there. They still have slaves there. Okay, Yad Agali, yeah. Okay.
Lawrence Freeman from African Desk at Executive Intelligence Review magazine. The questions on water and economic opportunity seems to raise a larger question that there's been no development in the Sahel and the Sahara for decades. And without water projects, and in fact, when Franklin Roosevelt was in this area in the 1940s, he said with water development, we could make this area bloom that would make California look like a cabbage patch. So if you don't have development, planting trees, you don't have water development projects, which do exist and are on the books in Africa, aren't you pretty much guaranteeing the conditions of life are so terrible and the economy is so terrible that young people alienated from society are going to take desperate actions because you're giving them no economic opportunity? And I mean, isn't this a major fault of policy from the West for a long period of time? The second question I have for Andrew, probably especially, but other people can ask, is how concerned should the Nigerians be about Boko Haram having direct access and being strengthened logistically and training and otherwise from Mali? This is a major concern for northern Nigeria. How legitimate is it?
To answer the question about the Tuaregs taking arms, I think that's one of the reasons why we try to highlight that northern Mali is a very complex society with lots of different groups, and Tuaregs are a minority, and the MNLA or MNLA supporters are a minority among Tuaregs. And this has been the case for all of the Tuareg rebellion of the past decades. In some cases, it's been particularly salient, like in 2006, for instance, when Iyad Agali started this movement, this new rebellion that started in Menaka. They couldn't find any support among the Tuaregs. There was very, very limited support from his own clan, from a couple of other groups. But basically, they realized very quickly it was getting nowhere. No one was supporting it. And they entered into negotiations very quickly. So yes, Tuareg are a minority, and militant Tuaregs who want independence and who are ready to take arms are a minority in the minority. And this is also a reason why we highlighted what we called option 3, which is a coalition of different groups. Because no one in the north, would be ready to accept, for instance, a Tuareg-led government. That just wouldn't work. There's just no reason why the Tuaregs should dominate. So the solution is going to have to be an integration of the different groups. In any case, it's going to have to be a negotiated solution, and it's going to have to be cross-ethnic. The Tuaregs are not part of the solution, but obviously not all of the solution, just the same way they're not all of the problem.
Andrew, do you want to pick up on the Boko Haram question in particular?
This is, as I said, this is a sort of difficult question to deal with. There is some evidence of linkages between Boko Haram and AQIM. There are accounts of Nigerians in northern Mali with AQIM, a very limited number of Nigerians, but still northern Nigerians, going back to 2006, 2008. There's evidence there have been arrests of a small number of what are believed to be Boko Haram operatives trying to go to northern Mali. There's evidence of communication between them. So I think the problem is that we really don't know. It's very difficult to evaluate. I think certainly Boko Haram has ways of manufacturing weapons, explosives in particular, and also getting weapons that don't run through northern Mali. There may be seeing some training, particularly with explosives, with weapons provision. I just evaluate that. And I think we need to look at all to be getting expertise, getting training, and getting weapons. And I don't think there's any reason to believe that AQIM is providing the lion's share of that. But there may be classified or other evidence that I just don't have access to. But based on the evidence that's publicly available, I think we can say that there seem to be some connections. I think I've seen an example of Boko Haram actually being in Mali. There are reports of members, but again, with the reports of fighters, it's very difficult to parse out how accurate they are, and even if they are accurate, if they reflect full reality, especially in terms of when you hear like examples of numbers of going to a certain place. So I would say there's limited evidence of connections. I can't evaluate the extent to which AQIM is responsible for the acceleration in Boko Haram activity and sophistication in northern Nigeria. I would suggest that it comes from a number of sources, with AQIM being one of them.
Thank you very much. We do need to start wrapping up here, and my apologies to questions that have not been answered, and we got a lot of very good questions on Twitter that we can't get to. But I want to take my prerogative and just ask one final question, and you can add on any concluding remarks that you want to make. In each of your initial presentations, in various ways, you made the point that we can't just be talking about a military solution in the north. There has to be a conversation about governance issues, about democratization, about all these related issues. But it still seems to me that the conversation, and we see this today, inevitably gravitates towards what are we going to do about these bad guys in the north. And there still seems to be a real gap between the conversation of dealing with extremists in the north and some sort of political process for the whole country, but centered in Bamako. On a very practical level, how do each of you see bridging this gap, if at all? Or maybe these are separate conversations, but is there ways to wrap this into a larger process for solving some of these, very difficult root causes of Mali's instability, that some of which we've discussed here today? So any thoughts on that, and any concluding remarks that you'd like to make?
So I'll just get us started. That's a really huge, tricky question. But I will step back and say I believe that at its core, a Malian solution based in dialogue that is to attempt to incorporate as many voices as possible into trying to figure out where and how, frankly, democracy fell short, and how to reinvigorate people's participation in that. Because, again, in terms of the North and the Tuareg, they are a minority, and this is an ongoing problem that has never been efficiently resolved, properly resolved. So it's on the table again, and I don't think that any solution basically, I think this has got to be an inclusive process of negotiation in order to move forward.
I would agree with that absolutely. It is possible to separate the two processes, and one can act in very concrete and pragmatic and very kind of cold-blooded ways to address security problems in the North now. One could do it, and one would just have to keep in mind that you can't pretend, right, that would yield any kind of enduring peace or anything like that. So it's possible, but the question is then, is it possible to do some sort of short-term kind of cold-blooded intervention in the North? And I'm not saying in terms of like ECOWAS, but in terms of using local militants against one another, some sort of divide and conquer kind of thing. There are all sorts of ways you could do it, and then try to queue up the democratic process in the South that's also going to include the North, and basically then do a handoff, sort of like a transfer. So you do the short-term agenda so that you can kind of knock AQIM on the head, and then kind of transfer things smoothly into some sort of larger thing, lets the whole thing fall apart. And I'm not sure how to do that, but that's certainly I think that's a legitimate objective. That's one way to go about this. If one doesn't want to just wait on the sidelines and watch the North while one goes about trying to do this political process. It's a lot of risk, though, a lot of risk.
I think it's the answer to this question to some extent is part of the broader discussion on decentralization. That's also one of the reasons why we've been emphasizing the role of local actors. There's sort of idea if the Malian army can do it, then let's get foreign armies. What about the people who live in the north? And the past peace agreements in the 90s, more recently, have also had part of it was enabling a northern population to police themselves, to be more proactive in implementing their own security. There were ideas of Tuareg and Arab units, or overwhelmingly Tuareg and Arab units, which would be more in charge of security. And these parts of the accords have rarely been implemented, if at all. And I understand it's a big issue for the Malian state. You know, to what extent do you want to devolve part of your security to local institutions? To what extent is it not the first step toward maybe some sort of autonomy or some sort of drifting off of the region? So I understand the political sensitivity there, but it's been a debate that's been going on for 2 decades now. And local population have been asking to be more in charge of security, saying, we know the terrain, we know these people, we can clean the region, we can make it safer, let us do it. So there's a tension here that's not new, that's important, there's good reasons on both sides why it's moving forward or not moving forward. If these accords had been implemented, would the North be safer now? Or would it be the opposite? You know, would it be even worse? Would it be would it be a perfect safe haven for criminality because they were able to co-opt local actors? Maybe. There's no way which way it would have gone, but it's still a big debate on the table, and it's still a potential solution.
Thank you. Andrew, the last brief word goes to you.
Yeah, I've much to add after those comments. I think that almost everyone agrees sort of a military, whether it's an intervention, targeted strikes, or a kind of longer term security presence back north. But I agree with Susanna that ultimately we're not going to have any kind of durable solution that doesn't have coherent political backing throughout the spectrum of Malian political and civil society. Otherwise, you're going to see the same recurring cycle of violence and uprising. There has to be a genuine political and societal commitment to a solution and to a political process, or else it's just not going to work. Or you could have, even in the best of cases, a military solution that deals to some extent with some of the security problems, but you're still not dealing with any of the underlying factors. And so I think that's the most important thing. You have to have Malian participation and some sort of broad-scale agreement behind a political solution.
Thank you very much. Let me thank all of our panelists for really enlightening discussion today. I think it's been very informative. Let me thank all of you for coming and wish you all happy holidays. And please join me in a round of applause.